In the last video, we talked about some domestic factors why some countries wouldn't be able to develop as well as others. But here we'll look at possible international factors that might slow or accelerate um, development. And so we'll look at the relationship between rich and poor countries. And again, rich countries want poorer countries to develop to increase markets. There's possibly a normative argument too that rich countries are responsible for development, but we'll leave that discussion for another class. All right. So we're looking for factors that might lead to variation in development, and one of them might be colonialism, specifically colonial history. Most imperial powers had colonies, and they used those colonies towards their benefit. And there's variation in how they did that. And there's some will argue that some countries were that were most exploited by their colonial masters were more likely to have trouble development later on, where some other countries that were able to not be easily colonized, say like the United States, had an easier time for development. So that's one argument. The other argument to be made related to this is that British colonies, because of the way that the British system of colonialization was set up, had an easier time developing in the future as opposed to more brutal colonial regimes such as Belgium or France. Another component of international the international factor that might lead to different variation in development is how the international economy is biased against developing countries. And one of the reasons why is the way that trade is set up. So if you look at how countries, particularly developing countries, what they are good at, they're good at selling primary products. So these are agricultural goods or raw materials or natural resources. Well, the better that they get at selling these products, the more of these products are on the market. But as more of these products are on the market, those prices of those products go down, and those countries have less and less resources. So they reach a problem because they are not able to coordinate with each other. And richer countries benefit from these small prices, so they're not going to necessarily step in on the side of these let me change this so you can see. Okay. So they're not going to necessarily step in on the side of these developing countries and help them with this competitive problem, right? And this is what we call as the terms of trade, and how the terms of trade are against these developing countries. As they export more, prices go down, and so they receive less and less revenue. Right? One way to combat that is to coordinate, and one way we see that is the creation of OPEC. Right? These oil-producing countries got together and essentially set the production prices in the 1970s to control the price of oil, and this created a huge spike in the price of oil. It was somewhat successful in the 1970s. It's less so now because there are so many incentives for these oil-producing countries to cheat in the system. But it is one way for these countries to fight against unfair terms of trade. The last component that makes it hard for states to develop are international institutions. International institutions like the IMF or the World Bank are controlled mostly by the United States and Western Europe. These are the countries with the most voting power in these institutions. And so it's not surprising that the programs of the IMF and the World Bank are designed to benefit rich countries, not poorer countries. And so when there's interactions between wealthy and poor countries in these international organizations, the lesser developed countries often lose out because of the rules. And here's the voting power of the IMF, and you see that the United States and the European Union comprise about 50% of the voting, give or take a couple of percentage points. And you see this with, again, with other international organizations as well, WTO or the World Bank. And because of this so-called bias, international institutions don't necessarily have the growth and development of poor nations at their the center of their institutional missions. So what can happen? So really before 1914, other rich countries didn't really care about poor countries. And now we see that rich countries really care about this as globalization has increased. So how do you level the playing field? How do you increase development? There's a couple different strategies that have been tried and been used. One is called import substitution industrialization. And what this means is whatever you don't have in your country, you import it, right? So it's a set of policies that's essentially, I'm sorry, let's do that. So if it's something that you need, so let's say I need cars, right? I'm a country, I don't make cars, I import a lot of cars. And so what I'm going to do is find a substitute for that. So I'm going to encourage domestic manufacturing of cars, and I'm going to create trade barriers and subsidies to make sure that my new car competing manufacturing can compete with the Toyotas or the Fords or whatever I was importing from before. And so what this needs is a lot of government intervention. It needs government intervention to create trade barriers, and it needs government intervention to provide capital for the investment for this modern industrial sector. That didn't really work out so well. Right? It's so capital intensive and essentially created a lot of inferior manufacturing products. So not so good. But the other thing that was a little bit more successful is these export-oriented industrialization, or EOI. And what these did is sort of identify markets where the country could be good at. Not necessarily markets that they were bad at, but markets that they could be good at, and put all of your effort into exporting these products that might be good. And so here is the policy that South Korea actually took, that they thought that they could be good at a certain type of exports, and then they put a lot of effort in making sure that those goods were competitive. So let's take, for example, South Korean company Hyundai. Hyundai makes a lot of different products, but one of the products that they make are cars. And in the 1980s, they decided to export cars, and they were pretty poor, right? These are cars that are that were not that competitive on the international market. They were known for low quality, but also low price, so some people bought them. But what they did to make sure that Hyundai survived in a very competitive market is provide a lot of subsidies to them as they developed into a more competitive car. And today, I would say that a Hyundai is a very competitive car in the market and does very well. And that could not have happened unless the South Korean government spent a lot of time and effort in intervening in the market, right? Both of these strategies, both an import substitution strategy and an export-oriented strategy, requires a lot of heavy intervention by the states and requires a lot of capital, right? And so those are two things that are hard for some countries to coordinate, because intervention by the state requires state capacity, which developing countries generally don't have. And these developing countries also don't have capital. They can try to borrow that capital, but that can be quite difficult to convince investors that their export schemes or import schemes are worthy of investment, right? What we see then is in the 1980s is sort of both of those strategies go by the wayside for the most part, except for Eastern Asian countries stay in an export-oriented path. But a lot of other countries, particularly in Latin America or other parts of Asia, adopted more of a globalization approach. Open your markets up to that larger economy and see what happens. And this is what we call as sort of the Washington Consensus. And what the Washington Consensus is accept market-oriented policies, and that will make your economy into a lean, mean fighting machine, which you can compete with in the open market. Part of that is removal of trade barriers to imports and exports to make your more competitive the world markets. Privatize your enterprises so they run more efficiently, and use fiscal and monetary policies limitedly to make sure this to focus on avoiding deficits and inflations to increase investment, right? So that's the general term of globalization. What this also did, though, is sort of opened up these countries more to the shocks of the international system. And so you see Latin America and parts of East Asia is very susceptible to financial crises in the 1990s. This openness sort of led them astray. And so that there's still debates about whether that Washington Consensus was the right approach to that. And that's a good transition to our next discussion of foreign aid.